I think it's timely that ASPI undertook a fresh look at our relations with the Pacific. In recent years, we've seen growing Chinese influence, we've seen the rise and growth of organised crime, we've seen the increasing interest of a range of other powers not traditionally associated with the Pacific, like Cuba, for example, having an increased interest in the region. At the same time, we've seen the difficulties that Australia has had with respect to Fiji. We've seen the growth of a number of sub-regional bodies like the Melanesian Spearhead Group and more recently a Polynesian group form. So I think the policy settings that Australia has had in recent years warranted a fresh look to see whether we were adequately taking account of these regional and extra-regional developments. So with those considerations in mind, ASPI commissioned Professor Richard Herr from the University of Tasmania to work with me in producing a comprehensive analysis of Australia's broader relations with the Pacific Islands region. Australia is the superpower of the South Pacific. We are the largest and most important, of course, the richest country in the Pacific. Yet at the same time, we're both an insider and an outsider when it comes to the region. We're an insider in the sense that we, of course, are a member of the various regional organisations and a principal financial backer. But on the other hand, we're external. We're an outsider in the sense that as the principal donor to the South Pacific, we have to evaluate the effectiveness of aid and the performance of the island countries. So that gives us in a way, a dual role in the Pacific, and the term that we use in the report to describe that is bifocalism. You know, viewed through one lens, if you like, we're a member of the Pacific family. Viewed through another lens, we're an outsider scrutinising the performance of the Pacific Islands, and that does create some tensions. But in terms of what Australia should do, the argument that we've advanced in the paper is that Australia has to some extent taken its eye off the ball in the Pacific, and the evidence for that is the increasing influence of external players in the region, the way in which the island countries are increasingly turning to sub-regional groupings, the way in which our policy settings on Fiji have not necessarily been accepted by some of the principal players in the region. So in terms of where to next, we advance a whole range of ideas, more than 16 ideas of where Australia can re-engage in the Pacific, and I'm more than happy obviously to talk about those. I guess the first point to make is that Australia, if we're going to deliver for the South Pacific Forum countries, we have to be seen much more as an insider, not an outsider. So some of the things that we're suggesting relate to, for example, increasing the labour mobility between the Pacific and Australia, and rather than just relying on the seasonal worker scheme that we've currently had in place, which has been largely ineffective, one of our recommendations is to look at the New Zealand model of allowing a quota of Pacific Islanders to come to Australia on a permanent basis, not as seasonal workers, but as part of a dedicated Pacific immigration program. In terms of extra-regional powers, one of the things we would like to see is China brought much more into regional law enforcement. Much of the organised crime in the Pacific can trace its origins back to China, and we felt it was important that the Chinese be drawn into regional law enforcement agencies. One of the most important linkages that Australia has to the South Pacific is through sport. And so one of the recommendations that we make in our report is to set up an Office of Diplomacy and Sport inside the Foreign Affairs Department. At the moment, our sporting ties in the Pacific have to be for developmental purposes. Indeed, the program's called Sport for Development in the Pacific. One of our findings is that we could leverage sporting contacts with the South Pacific for diplomatic objectives, and that is best done by creating an Office of Sport and Diplomacy inside the Foreign Affairs Department. We also recommend that in terms of bright Pacific Islanders, they be given the opportunity to, for the last 2 years of high school, to come to some of our higher performing boarding schools in Australia. Not only will that, of course, allow Australian students to gain a much greater degree of cultural familiarity with the Pacific Islanders, but of course it will set up long term our linkages with potential Pacific Island leaders. Also, along the same lines, we've recommended that we have another look at a Colombo Plan for the Pacific. We're not saying that there aren't good things happening with bringing Pacific Islanders to study at our universities and colleges, but we argue now that we could do so much more to really strengthen the people-to-people ties. In fact, one of the interesting findings was that the biggest hole in our Pacific policy, if you like, are Pacific people. There aren't that many Pacific Islanders living in Australia, and indeed it's ironic that we have many more Polynesians living in Australia than we do Melanesians, and that's because of course Polynesians can go to New Zealand, and then from New Zealand they can come to Australia. So I guess one of the themes of the report is to strengthen the people-to-people linkages between the island countries and Australia. With respect to Fiji, the report finds that our current policy settings have really produced a dead end. We're now closer to the election in Fiji 2014 than we are to the 2006 coup. And what we found was that Australia ought to seriously re-examine the opportunities that we now have to try and assist Fiji back to the path of parliamentary democracy. And indeed, one of the suggestions we make is that Australia assist in establishing an electronic voter roll for Fiji is one tangible piece of evidence that we back Fiji's commitment to return to parliamentary democracy in 2014. In terms of building the understanding of Australians of Pacific affairs, I think it's timely that Australia has a dedicated Pacific Studies Institute. After all, the Commonwealth Government has directly funded a US Studies Centre. It's funded a China Studies Centre at the ANU. A couple of years ago they funded a Public Policy Institute in Melbourne. And I think there is a strong case in Australia, given our superpower role, if you like, in the South Pacific, given that it's our patch, for having a dedicated Pacific Studies Institute in Australia that would attract not only Australian scholars but also, of course, people from the Pacific to contribute to the teaching and research of such an institute. I think also the fact is that, sad to say, I think in our diplomatic service, it's not really recognised the importance of a posting to the Pacific, and one of the things that we've recommended is that as part of a normal and complete diplomatic career, our foreign affairs officers have some postings to the Pacific throughout their career. I think in that way we build up a stockpile of expertise about our island neighbourhood. So they are some of the broad areas that the report canvasses across traditional security, non-traditional security, and building up the people-to-people contacts. Overall, I think the argument that we make in the report is that we have taken our eye off the ball in the Pacific. We run the Pacific with a parliamentary secretary. Other countries, including our major ally, the United States, expects Australia to take the lead in the Pacific. And I believe that the suggestions that Professor Herr and I have made in the report make a significant contribution to try and advance that agenda of strengthening Australia's role as an insider in the Pacific family.